November 17, 1942. The border region between Vichy, France and Switzerland. Robert Mitchell stood at the entrance of an abandoned railway tunnel, studying dimensions that existed only in his imagination overlaid on crumbling infrastructure. Behind him, members of the French resistance waited with expressions mixing hope and skepticism. Before him, 3 miles of collapsed tunnel, partially flooded sections, and unstable geology that every engineer would call impossible to restore. Yet beyond that tunnel, across the Swiss border, waited sanctuary for thousands trapped by Vichy collaboration with Nazi occupation forces. The deportations had accelerated throughout the autumn. Trains leaving French stations carrying Jewish families toward camps in the east. Bureaucratic machinery processing human lives with efficient indifference. Mitchell had arrived in France 6 weeks earlier, an OSS operative whose engineering background was supposed to support sabotage operations against German infrastructure. Instead, he found himself proposing something that violated every principle of his training. Not destroying a tunnel, but rebuilding one in secret, creating an underground passage that could move thousands to safety, while Vichy police and German patrols secured every visible border crossing. His resistance contact called it tactical insanity. Mitchell called it the only option that mathematics and conscience could support. The geography of occupied France had become a landscape of calculated despair. Following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Nazi regime had intensified its policies throughout occupied territories. In France, the Vichy government, nominally independent but functionally subordinate to German demands, had begun systematic cooperation with deportation orders. The bureaucratic machinery operated with disturbing efficiency. Identity documents checked, Jewish residents registered, property confiscated, families relocated to transit camps before final transport eastward. By autumn 1942, the pattern had become clear to those paying attention. Families who boarded those trains did not return. Letters ceased after departure. The official explanations, resettlement, labor deployment, relocation to eastern territories, contradicted the fragmentary evidence filtering back through resistance networks. The truth was emerging, though its full scope remained beyond comprehension for most who heard the reports. Switzerland represented the nearest sanctuary, a neutral nation that, despite its own complicated relationship with refugees, offered at least the possibility of survival. But the Swiss border had become increasingly militarized. Vichy police patrolled the frontier with German oversight, checkpoints established at every road crossing, patrols monitoring forest paths, documentation requirements designed to identify and prevent Jewish refugees from crossing. Attempting passage through official channels meant presenting papers that identified exactly those characteristics the regime sought to target. Attempting illegal crossing risked immediate arrest. Robert Mitchell's background made him an unusual choice for resistance work. Before the war, he had designed railway infrastructure in the American Southwest, specializing in tunnel construction through challenging geology. The OSS recruited him for his engineering expertise, intending to deploy him for industrial sabotage, destroying bridges, collapsing tunnels, disrupting German supply lines. He arrived in France in October 1942, linked with a resistance network operating in the border regions, and immediately began assessing potential sabotage targets. The abandoned railway tunnel had appeared on German maps as a completed demolition, destroyed by retreating French forces in 1940 to prevent its use by advancing German armies. Multiple explosions had collapsed sections near both entrances, and subsequent flooding had rendered the middle sections impassable. German engineers had surveyed it, determined restoration would require months of work and substantial resources, and classified it as militarily irrelevant. Mitchell examined those same German engineering reports, obtained through resistance infiltration of Vichy administrative offices, and reached a different conclusion. The tunnel wasn't destroyed beyond use. It was destroyed beyond obvious use. With precise engineering, targeted excavation, and careful water management, sections could be cleared and stabilized, not for railway traffic, but for human passage. The work would be dangerous, require absolute secrecy, and depend on geological assumptions he couldn't verify without exposing the project. But it was technically possible. The resistance network received Mitchell's proposal with profound skepticism. Pierre Rousseau, the regional resistance coordinator, summarized the objections with brutal clarity. The tunnel required excavation through unstable rock, meaning potential collapse that could kill everyone working inside. The flooded sections needed pumping, but pumps required electricity or fuel, resources that would be noticed by Vichy authorities monitoring consumption. The work would generate noise, vibration, and debris that could attract German patrols. Most critically, the timeline Mitchell proposed, 4 months to create a passable route, assumed the project remained undiscovered throughout that period. The mathematical realities supported Rousseau's skepticism. The tunnel stretched 3 miles through mountainous terrain. The collapsed sections totaled approximately 800 feet of blocked passage. The flooded zones held an estimated 200,000 gallons of water. Mitchell's engineering calculations suggested a crew of 30 workers, operating in shifts, could clear enough space for human passage in approximately 16 weeks. But those calculations assumed optimal conditions, perfect secrecy, and luck sustained over thousands of labor hours. Yet Mitchell had also calculated the alternative. Intelligence from resistance networks indicated deportation trains were departing at increasing frequency. The transit camps near the Swiss border held approximately 5,000 Jewish refugees who had fled from Paris and other northern cities, awaiting either documentation that would never arrive or deportation that was inevitable. Every week of delay meant hundreds more forced onto trains. Every month of inaction meant thousands lost to a fate that was becoming increasingly clear despite official denials. The resistance operated on limited resources and impossible choices. Every operation risked exposure, arrest, execution. They could attempt to forge documents. Slow, dangerous, limited in scale. They could organize small group escapes through forest routes. Weather-dependent, physically demanding, unsuitable for children or elderly. They could attack the deportation infrastructure, effective as sabotage, but inviting massive reprisals against civilian populations. Mitchell's tunnel proposal offered different mathematics. One impossible project that, if successful, could evacuate thousands through a route the Germans believed non-existent. The risk was concentrated in the construction phase. Once operational, the tunnel could move people continuously, protected from weather, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, bypassing every checkpoint and patrol. Rousseau studied Mitchell's engineering drawings spread across a farmhouse table, diagrams showing tunnel cross-sections, water drainage systems, support structures improvised from salvaged materials. He looked at the American engineer whose confident optimism seemed disconnected from occupied France's brutal realities, then made the calculation that defined resistance work: impossible risks justified by unacceptable alternatives. He committed 30 workers, promised to secure tools and materials through resistance supply networks, and gave Mitchell 4 months to prove that American engineering optimism could overcome European geology and Nazi occupation. The work began in darkness, conducted by men and women who understood they were betting their lives on an American's calculations about rock stability and water tables. The tunnel's French entrance was located in a forest ravine, concealed by vegetation and accessible only through paths that avoided main roads. German patrols passed within half a mile but never investigated the area. Their maps showed the tunnel as completely destroyed, making surveillance seem unnecessary. Mitchell organized the workers into 3 shifts operating around the clock. The first crew cleared debris from the entrance, sorting rubble into material that could be reused for support structures and waste that needed disposal. The disposal itself required careful planning. Debris couldn't simply be piled outside the entrance where aerial reconnaissance might notice. Instead, workers scattered it throughout the surrounding forest, mixing tunnel rock with natural geological features, until no pattern remained visible. The second shift focused on the collapsed main section, excavating carefully through unstable rubble while installing temporary supports. Mitchell designed a progressive stabilization system using salvaged railway timbers, creating a framework that distributed weight laterally, rather than relying on the weakened rock overhead. Each meter of advancement required hours of careful excavation, constant monitoring for shifts in the surrounding geology, and immediate response to any sign of instability. The third shift managed the flooded sections, operating hand pumps in relay to gradually lower water levels. They couldn't pump quickly. The water had to go somewhere, and releasing it downstream might alert authorities to unusual flow patterns. Instead, Mitchell designed a dispersal system that released water slowly through multiple natural channels, maintaining flow rates that appeared consistent with seasonal rainfall. The physical demands exceeded anything the resistance workers had experienced. Tunnel excavation required sustained labor in confined spaces, breathing air thick with rock dust, working in near-complete darkness to avoid light that might be spotted from outside. Several workers suffered injuries, crushed fingers, respiratory problems, one serious case when a support timber failed and trapped a worker under fallen rock. They extracted him alive, but the incident emphasized how completely they were committed beyond the possibility of external assistance. By the end of the first month, they had advanced 40 meters into the tunnel and lowered water levels in the flooded sections by approximately 30%. Mitchell recalculated his timeline based on actual progress. The work was proceeding slower than optimistic estimates, but faster than pessimistic projections. They were on track to complete the passage within the 4-month window, assuming no major geological surprises and continued luck regarding German patrols. Then, in early December, a Vichy police unit established a new checkpoint 2 miles from the tunnel entrance, complicating access routes and increasing the risk of discovery. The checkpoint changed everything about operational security. Previously, workers could approach the tunnel through forest paths, carrying tools and materials with minimal risk. Now, police were stopping travelers, checking documents, questioning anyone whose presence seemed unusual. The resistance network had to redesign the entire logistics system, workers approaching from different directions, traveling individually rather than in groups, concealing tools as agricultural equipment. Mitchell established a new protocol. No worker approached the tunnel directly from their home village. Instead, they traveled to intermediate locations, farms, churches, small businesses operated by resistance sympathizers, where they changed clothes, collected tools, and proceeded to the tunnel through routes that avoided the checkpoint. The system added hours to each shift change, but reduced the risk of pattern recognition that might alert authorities. The checkpoint's presence also meant increased German patrol activity in the region. Wehrmacht units began conducting sweeps through forest areas, ostensibly searching for resistance weapon caches, but effectively surveilling territory they had previously ignored. On 3 occasions, patrols passed within 500 meters of the tunnel entrance. Each time, workers inside remained motionless, tools silent, barely breathing while German soldiers walked past discussing mundane topics, rations, weather, rumors about the Eastern Front. These close encounters revealed an unexpected vulnerability in Mitchell's plan. The tunnel work generated vibration that traveled through the surrounding rock. At the entrance, these vibrations were imperceptible, but at certain distances, between 300 and 600 meters, the vibrations became faintly audible as a low-frequency humming. If German patrols happened to stop and rest in exactly the wrong location, they might hear evidence of the excavation. Mitchell solved this by implementing a listening post system. Resistance members positioned themselves at key distances from the tunnel, monitoring for patrol activity. When Germans approached the danger zone, signals were passed to the tunnel entrance and work ceased until the patrol departed. The system added further delays to progress but prevented the catastrophic discovery that would doom the entire project. By mid-December, they had penetrated 120 meters into the tunnel and reduced flooding to manageable levels. The work was succeeding, but the timeline was compressing. Intelligence reports indicated that deportations would intensify in January as the Vichy government sought to meet quotas demanded by German authorities. The 5,000 refugees in the transit camps faced imminent transfer. Mitchell calculated they needed to complete the tunnel by late February, giving them approximately 10 weeks to excavate the remaining sections and establish secure procedures for moving thousands of people through the passage. The mathematics of geology, politics, and human desperation were converging toward a single point where either the tunnel would be ready or 5,000 people would board trains heading east. The flooded sections presented challenges that pure excavation couldn't solve. Water had saturated the tunnel's foundation, creating mud that sucked at boots and made footing treacherous. Worse, the constant moisture had weakened support structures installed decades earlier when the railway company first built the tunnel. Mitchell's team discovered entire sections where wooden supports had rotted, leaving only the rock itself holding the ceiling in place. Rock that showed ominous cracks suggesting imminent collapse. Mitchell designed emergency stabilization using whatever materials the resistance could procure. Salvaged steel beams from a bombed factory in Lyon. Railway ties stolen from a German supply depot. Concrete mixed in small batches at a resistance-operated quarry, then transported to the tunnel in bags labeled as agricultural lime. Each section required custom engineering. There were no standard solutions, just improvised structures built from mismatched components held together by careful calculation and desperate hope. The concrete work created its own complications. Mixing concrete generated distinctive sounds and required water, cement, and aggregate in quantities that might attract attention. The resistance established a cover story. They were supposedly repairing foundations at a nearby barn, legitimate agricultural work that explained the materials. German authorities checked the documentation, found the permits in order, forged by resistance members who had infiltrated Vichy administrative offices, and didn't investigate further. But the concrete curing process was unpredictable in the tunnel's cold, damp environment. Mitchell's engineering knowledge came from American Southwest construction, where concrete cured in heat and dry air. In this French tunnel, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and humidity at near saturation, the concrete cured slower, sometimes developing cracks, occasionally failing completely and requiring removal and replacement. Each failure cost days and depleted their limited concrete supply. The psychological toll on the workers was becoming evident. These were not professional miners or engineers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers who had joined the resistance from moral conviction, not technical expertise. The tunnel's confined spaces, constant danger of collapse, and physical exhaustion were pushing several to their breaking points. 2 workers quit, unable to continue. Others persisted through what appeared to be pure stubborn determination, rather than any remaining optimism about success. Mitchell himself was showing strain. He had lost 15 pounds, his hands permanently blackened by rock dust that no amount of washing could remove, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He spent 16 hours daily in the tunnel, calculating, adjusting, solving problems that his university education had never prepared him for. At night he lay awake in a resistance safe house, mentally reviewing every section of tunnel, searching for weaknesses he might have missed, calculating whether the rock overhead would hold or come crashing down on workers whose trust in his engineering judgment was absolute. January brought winter cold that created new challenges. The water in the flooded sections began forming ice, expanding in cracks and threatening to shatter rock that had remained stable. Mitchell implemented a heating system using portable braziers, dangerous in the confined tunnel atmosphere, but necessary to prevent ice damage to the excavation. The braziers consumed fuel that the resistance had to steal from German supply depots, adding risk to an already precarious operation. The heating system created its own hazard: carbon monoxide accumulation in poorly ventilated sections. 2 workers collapsed from gas exposure and had to be dragged to fresh air, where they recovered slowly, coughing and disoriented. Mitchell established ventilation protocols, mandatory breaks every 2 hours when working near the braziers, air quality checks using candles whose flames would dim if oxygen levels dropped dangerously. Meanwhile, the security situation continued deteriorating. In mid-January, Vichy police arrested 3 resistance members in a village 8 miles from the tunnel. Under interrogation, which included methods the resistance didn't discuss in detail, one of the arrested revealed fragments of information about resistance activities in the region. He didn't know about the tunnel specifically, but he mentioned that something significant was happening near the Swiss border, that American operatives were involved, that the resistance was committing unusual resources to a single project. This partial compromise forced a complete security review. Mitchell met with Rousseau and other resistance leaders to assess whether the tunnel project had been exposed. The consensus was uncertain. The arrested member knew enough to make German authorities suspicious, but perhaps not enough to pinpoint the tunnel location. They decided to continue but implemented additional security measures, rotating workers more frequently so no single person knew too much, establishing multiple false projects that might draw German attention away from the actual tunnel, preparing evacuation plans in case the site was discovered. The paranoia was justified. 2 weeks after the arrests, German units began conducting systematic searches of abandoned infrastructure in border regions, old factories, unused warehouses, and specifically, destroyed tunnels. They were checking sites their maps showed as militarily irrelevant, suggesting someone had told them to look for hidden resistance operations in unexpected locations. A German engineering unit arrived at the tunnel's French entrance on January 28, 1943. They stood at the entrance, studying the collapsed opening, discussing whether to investigate further. Inside, 200 meters down the passage, 16 resistance workers froze in absolute silence, hand tools motionless, barely breathing while German voices echoed from the entrance. The Germans debated for 7 minutes, an eternity to those trapped inside. then concluded the entrance was too thoroughly collapsed to warrant further investigation. They marked the site as checked on their maps and departed. The workers remained motionless for 20 minutes after the Germans left, making certain they were truly gone before resuming work with hands that trembled from released tension. The near discovery accelerated the timeline from calculated urgency to desperate race. Intelligence reports indicated that major deportation operations were scheduled for mid-March. The Vichy government was preparing to clear the transit camps, processing thousands of refugees for transport eastward. The tunnel had to be operational before those deportations began, meaning completion by early March at the latest, a deadline that was rapidly approaching while significant excavation remained incomplete. Mitchell pushed the work crews to their absolute limits. Shifts extended from 8 hours to 10, then 12. Workers operated beyond exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that thousands of lives depended on meters of daily progress through uncooperative geology. Several suffered injuries from exhaustion-related accidents. A pickaxe striking a foot instead of rock, a support timber dropped on a hand, a worker fainting from exertion and striking his head on fallen stone. The human cost was becoming visible in faces that showed permanent weariness, in bodies that moved with mechanical determination rather than physical strength. Yet no one suggested stopping. The mathematics were too clear. Every day of delay meant the deportation schedule moved closer, meant fewer people the tunnel could potentially save, meant the difference between rescue and catastrophe narrowing to nothing. By late February, they had penetrated to within 100 meters of the Swiss end of the tunnel. The Swiss entrance had been blocked by Swiss authorities themselves in 1940. Neutral nations had their own complicated positions on refugees, but resistance contacts in Switzerland had been preparing to clear that entrance simultaneously with the French excavation. Coordination between French and Swiss resistance groups required coded messages passed through circuitous routes, creating communication delays that added frustration to an already stressed operation. Then breakthrough came literally. On February 26th, Mitchell's excavation crew broke through the final collapsed section and encountered Swiss workers digging from the opposite direction. The two groups stood in a tunnel section no more than 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, shaking hands across the border, while rock dust settled around them. They had created a passage through 3 miles of mountain, connecting occupied France to neutral Switzerland, providing a route that no German patrol could block because no German command knew it existed. But creating the passage was only the first challenge. Now they had to move 5,000 people through it without alerting authorities on either side of the border, a logistical operation that would require coordination, timing, and luck, on a scale that made the engineering challenges seem straightforward by comparison. Mitchell stood in that narrow passage, looking at the faces of French and Swiss workers who had made this impossible thing real, and began calculating the next impossibility: how to evacuate thousands through a tunnel that could accommodate people only in single file. The operational planning required transforming a rough excavation into a functional evacuation route. The tunnel sections varied dramatically. Some areas offered enough headroom for people to walk upright. Others required crawling through spaces barely 2 feet high. The flooded zones, though largely drained, still held enough water that people would wade through ankle-deep mud. The entire 3-mile passage would take approximately 4 hours to traverse at the slow, careful pace required by confined conditions. Mitchell organized the evacuation system with the same engineering precision he had applied to the excavation. The 5,000 refugees would move in groups of 50, spaced at intervals to prevent overcrowding in the narrow sections. Each group would have a guide, a resistance member who had worked on the tunnel and knew every dangerous section, every low ceiling, every unstable area. The guides carried battery-powered lights salvaged from mining equipment, providing minimal illumination that wouldn't be visible from outside the tunnel. The refugees themselves presented challenges Mitchell's engineering calculations couldn't fully address. Many were families with young children. Some were elderly individuals whose physical condition had deteriorated during months in transit camps. A few were injured or ill, capable of walking but requiring assistance. Moving 5,000 people of varying abilities through a passage designed for able-bodied workers would require patience, flexibility, and time they couldn't spare. The resistance established staging areas near the French entrance, farms and churches within walking distance where refugees could gather before entering the tunnel. The Swiss end required similar coordination, with Swiss resistance members preparing reception facilities where people emerging from the tunnel could be processed, provided food and medical attention, and dispersed into Switzerland's refugee system before authorities noticed an unexplained influx of 5,000 people. The security challenges were immense. Moving 5,000 people required transport from the transit camps to the staging areas, a movement that would be noticed by Vichy police monitoring the camps. The resistance developed a cover story. They claimed to be relocating refugees to different facilities, producing forged transfer orders that appeared authentic. The plan required multiple collaborating elements within the Vichy administration: clerks willing to process false paperwork, police willing to ignore irregular documentation, administrators willing to delay reporting to German oversight. On March 8, 1943, the first group of refugees arrived at the staging area, 50 people, men, women, children, who had been told only that they were being moved to a safer location. They stood in a farmhouse listening as resistance members explained what would happen. They would walk through a tunnel, a journey of several hours in darkness and difficult conditions, emerging in Switzerland where they would be protected by neutral status and international law. Several refugees expressed disbelief. After months of betrayal by officials, false promises from authorities, and systematic persecution, the idea that strangers would risk execution to dig a tunnel seemed too extraordinary to be real. The first group entered the tunnel at 2300 hours on March 8th. Mitchell led them personally, wanting to witness how the theoretical evacuation plan functioned under actual conditions. The refugees moved slowly, adjusting to the darkness, learning to navigate uneven ground by touch and the faint glow from the guide's lamp. Parents carried small children. Older children held hands, forming chains that kept families together. Adults helped elderly members over difficult sections. The psychological impact of the tunnel became evident immediately. After months in open transit camps, crowded but visible under sky, the tunnel's enclosed darkness triggered fear responses. Several refugees began experiencing acute anxiety, their breathing becoming rapid, movements erratic. Mitchell and the resistance guides had anticipated this and implemented calming protocols: frequent stops, reassurance spoken in quiet voices, encouragement to focus on the present step rather than the distance remaining. The 4-hour estimate proved optimistic. The first group required 5.5 hours to traverse the tunnel, emerging at the Swiss entrance exhausted, muddy, but safely beyond German reach. Swiss resistance members guided them to prepared locations where they were registered as refugees, given food and clothing, and incorporated into Switzerland's complicated refugee system. Over the following nights, the evacuation continued. Groups of 50 every evening, moving through the tunnel under cover of darkness when German and Vichy patrols were less active. By March 15th, they had evacuated 800 people. By March 22nd, 2,000. The operation was succeeding, but time pressure intensified as intelligence reports indicated Vichy authorities were preparing major deportation actions scheduled for early April. Then on March 24th, a crisis emerged at the Swiss end. Swiss border authorities, unaware of the tunnel operation, noticed the unexplained appearance of hundreds of refugees in a region where official border crossings had registered minimal traffic. They began investigating, demanding explanations from local officials who were themselves resistance members, walking a dangerous line between helping refugees and maintaining their cover within Swiss administration. The Swiss resistance sent urgent messages through the communication network. The tunnel operation needed to pause while they managed the official investigation. But pausing meant the remaining 3,000 refugees stayed in French transit camps, vulnerable to the imminent deportation orders. Mitchell faced an impossible choice: continue evacuations and risk exposing the entire operation to Swiss authorities who might close the tunnel, or pause and watch as thousands were deported to fates everyone now understood were not mere relocation, but systematic elimination. He consulted with Rousseau and other resistance leaders. They made the calculation that had defined the entire operation. Moral imperative outweighed tactical caution. They would continue evacuations at an accelerated pace, moving as many people as possible before either Swiss authorities or German forces discovered and shut down the tunnel. The accelerated schedule meant multiple groups moving through the tunnel simultaneously, a practice Mitchell had previously avoided because it created congestion in the narrow sections. But time had become the dominant variable in every calculation. They increased to 4 groups per night, spacing them at 1-hour intervals, accepting the risk of backup in confined spaces in exchange for doubled evacuation capacity. The increased traffic revealed structural weaknesses in sections Mitchell had considered stable. The constant foot traffic combined with vibration from people moving through confined spaces destabilized supports in areas that had seemed secure during excavation. On the night of March 28th, a support beam in a narrow section fractured, causing a partial ceiling collapse that trapped one group between fallen rock and solid wall. Mitchell was leading another group 200 meters behind when word reached him about the collapse. He left his group with their guide and rushed forward, arriving to find 30 people trapped in a space rapidly filling with dust and small debris continuing to fall. The collapse hadn't blocked the tunnel completely. There was perhaps 3 feet of clearance between fallen rock and ceiling, but attempting passage risked triggering further collapse that could seal the tunnel permanently. He assessed the situation with the cold calculation that engineering emergencies demanded. The rock had stabilized temporarily, but continued vibration from people moving could restart the collapse. They needed to clear the debris, reinforce the area, and move the trapped group through, all while additional groups waited behind schedule, their presence in the staging area increasing the risk of discovery. Mitchell and 3 resistance workers spent 2 hours removing fallen rock piece by piece, testing each removal to ensure it didn't trigger further collapse. They installed emergency supports using timbers carried from the nearest stable section, creating a framework that would hold long enough for passage, but might not survive extended stress. Finally, they guided the trapped group through one at a time, each person moving with agonizing care through the 3-foot space while rock creaked overhead. All 30 made it through. Mitchell then faced another decision: continue using the tunnel knowing this section was now critically unstable, or pause operations to properly repair the damage. Repairing would require days during which deportations would proceed. He chose to continue but implemented new protocols. Groups would pass through the unstable section in smaller subgroups, minimizing weight and vibration, accepting slower progress as the price of avoiding catastrophic failure. By March 31st, they had evacuated 4,200 people. 800 remained in the transit camps. Intelligence reports indicated Vichy police were preparing to conduct final processing on April 3rd, loading refugees onto trains for deportation. The tunnel operation had 72 hours to complete. The final 3 days became a continuous operation, abandoning the careful scheduling that had maintained security in favor of desperate urgency. Groups moved through the tunnel every 2 hours around the clock, guides operating on minimal sleep and maximum commitment. Mitchell stationed himself at the unstable section, personally overseeing each group's passage through the danger zone, ready to implement emergency procedures if collapse occurred. The resistance network mobilized every resource for these final evacuations. Members who had maintained careful cover within Vichy administration called in all accumulated favors, creating bureaucratic confusion that delayed the scheduled deportations by 36 hours, buying crucial time for the tunnel operations. Others conducted diversion operations, staging small sabotage actions that drew German attention away from the border regions, forcing police and Wehrmacht units to respond to threats that were real but irrelevant to the tunnel. On the Swiss side, resistance members had reached accommodation with border authorities. They couldn't reveal the tunnel. That would require Swiss officials to close it, maintaining their neutral status. But they could create administrative complexity that delayed questions about the refugee influx. Paperwork was filed incorrectly, requiring resubmission. Documentation was lost and had to be recreated. The bureaucratic machinery that usually moved with efficient precision suddenly encountered inexplicable delays that bought time measured in hours, while refugees continued emerging from the tunnel. The physical toll on everyone involved had become extreme. Mitchell was operating on perhaps 3 hours of sleep across 4 days, sustained by coffee and adrenaline, and the knowledge that 800 people's survival depended on him remaining functional. Resistance workers showed similar exhaustion, some literally sleeping while standing, leaning against tunnel walls during brief pauses between groups. By the morning of April 2nd, fewer than 200 refugees remained in the transit camps. That afternoon, Vichy police arrived to begin final processing, checking documentation, organizing transport, preparing to load people onto trains scheduled for departure on April 3rd. But they found the camps holding only those refugees too ill to travel through the tunnel, approximately 40 individuals who required medical care beyond what the resistance could provide during the evacuation. The police were confused by the dramatic reduction in camp population. Official records showed 5,000 refugees. They found fewer than 50. Their reports to German oversight described the discrepancy, speculated about administrative errors, suggested that documentation had been compromised. German authorities ordered investigation, but by the time investigators arrived to examine the situation, the tunnel had completed its final evacuations. The last group, 23 refugees, including several families with young children, entered the tunnel on the evening of April 2, 1943. Mitchell guided them personally, wanting to witness the completion of an operation that had consumed 4 months of his life and risked dozens of others. They emerged into Swiss territory at 0347 hours on April 3, 1943. The pre-dawn darkness concealed their arrival from casual observation, though Swiss resistance members waited with food, blankets, and transportation to disperse the refugees before daylight made their presence obvious. Mitchell stood at the tunnel's Swiss entrance watching as families who had spent months in transit camps, who had faced deportation to circumstances everyone now understood were not resettlement, but elimination, walked into a neutral nation where international law provided at least theoretical protection. The Viennese Dr. Mitchell had met in the transit camps, a man named Dr. Kaufmann, who had volunteered to help coordinate the evacuations, approached him as the last refugees departed toward safe houses. "You understand what you've accomplished?" Mitchell, exhausted beyond coherent thought, simply shook his head. 5,000 people, Dr. Kaufmann continued. 5,000 lives that would have ended on those trains. 5,000 futures that continue because one American engineer believed a tunnel through a mountain was possible. It was 30 resistance workers, Mitchell corrected. It was Swiss contacts who prepared the reception. It was French administrators who created bureaucratic delays. It was dozens of people, not one engineer. Yes, Dr. Kaufmann agreed. But someone had to propose the impossible idea. Someone had to look at a collapsed tunnel and see not destruction but possibility. Mitchell returned to the French side later that morning, where Rousseau and remaining resistance members were preparing to seal the tunnel. Not completely, but enough to make it appear permanently unusable if German investigators examined it. They collapsed sections near both entrances, flooded the accessible areas, removed all evidence of recent excavation. Within days, the tunnel would appear exactly as German maps showed it. Destroyed, abandoned, militarily irrelevant. Mitchell's OSS handlers ordered him to leave France immediately. The tunnel operation had attracted too much German attention, and his continued presence endangered the resistance network. He departed through the same clandestine routes he had arrived through, carrying with him maps and engineering diagrams of a tunnel that no longer officially existed. Years later, after the war ended and the full scope of the Nazi elimination programs became documented history, Mitchell would be asked whether he regretted violating OSS directives to pursue the tunnel project instead of his assigned sabotage missions. His answer was consistent. Destroying infrastructure was my job. Saving lives was my responsibility. I chose responsibility. The tunnel, sealed and forgotten by official history, had proven that individuals could choose to act when action seemed impossible, that engineering knowledge could serve mercy as effectively as it served destruction, that courage sometimes required building rather than destroying. Robert Mitchell never spoke publicly about the tunnel operation during his lifetime. OSS records classified the mission details, maintaining secrecy that extended decades beyond the war's conclusion. The resistance members who excavated the tunnel returned to their normal lives, farming, teaching, shopkeeping, carrying knowledge of what they had accomplished, but rarely sharing it beyond their immediate communities. Swiss authorities never officially acknowledged the tunnel's role in refugee rescue, maintaining Switzerland's complicated neutrality, even in historical retrospect. The 5,000 refugees who passed through that tunnel dispersed across the world. Many emigrated to America after the war, others to Israel. Some remained in Europe rebuilding communities that had been systematically destroyed. They carried with them the memory of walking through darkness toward safety, guided by strangers who risked execution because conscience demanded action. In 1983, 40 years after the operation, a French historian researching resistance activities in border regions discovered fragmentary references to an unusual infrastructure project near the Swiss frontier. Following archival trails through multiple countries' records, she eventually identified Mitchell, by then a retired civil engineer living in Arizona, and persuaded him to discuss the operation. The resulting documentation included engineering diagrams he had preserved, testimony from surviving resistance members, and accounts from refugees who remembered the tunnel as the moment their impossible situation became possible survival. Mitchell died in 1987. His obituary in engineering journals mentioned a distinguished career designing infrastructure throughout the American Southwest. It didn't mention a tunnel in occupied France, an operation that violated his OSS mission parameters, a 4-month excavation that saved 5,000 lives. That story emerged gradually, assembled by historians documenting the countless individual actions that collectively constituted resistance to systematic persecution. The tunnel itself remains sealed, its exact location protected to preserve structural stability and respect the privacy of the region's residents. But the engineering drawings survive in archives, testament to what becomes possible when technical knowledge combines with moral commitment, when individuals decide that following orders matters less than following conscience. 5,000 people walked through that tunnel. They emerged into continued existence because one engineer looked at a collapsed passage and calculated not what was destroyed, but what could be rebuilt. Because 30 resistance workers dug through unstable rock for 4 months. Because Swiss contacts prepared reception facilities. Because dozens of people chose action over paralysis, risk over safety, possibility over despair.